So the next paper is on optimal illiquidity, and James Choi is the presenter, and Dave Richardson is going to be his discussant.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. This is joint work with John Beshears, Chris Clayton, David Laibson, and Brigitte Madrian at Harvard, and Christopher Harris at the University of Cambridge. And our paper is really motivated by two observations. One is that the US is really an outlier internationally in how much liquidity we allow in our defined contribution balances. And so if you have a 401k, once you leave your employer, you can roll those balances over to an IRA, and then you can withdraw those balances early before retirement for any reason and pay only a 10% penalty. And for some purposes, you can actually withdraw without a penalty. And even for the 401k balances, many people can withdraw a loan against those balances with pretty much no penalty. In contrast, in Canada and Australia, you pretty much have no liquidity unless you're long-term unemployed. And in Germany, Singapore, and the UK, you have basically no liquidity with a few exceptions. And the result is that in the US, we have a very leaky retirement savings system. So the fact is that for households that are under the age of 55, for every dollar that they put in, 40 cents of it simultaneously comes out in taxable pre-retirement withdrawals. And this is not even counting loans against 401ks. So the question is this too much leakage? And related to that is 10% really the right penalty for early withdrawals when when Congress was setting up the precursor to the 401k IRA system? There was a debate about whether the penalty should be 10% or 30%. So where exactly did this 10% penalty come from, other than the fact that we have 10 fingers? And so in order to answer this question, you really need a theory of what the right amount of withdrawal is. And so that's what we're going to present today. And to have a theory, you need to have some notion, some building block for why we would want to make savings illiquid in the first place. And so I think a pretty reasonable reason for trying to lock up some savings is that there are some people in the population that have limited self-control, which causes them to want to consume too much before retirement, and so you want to restrict people's ability to do that. But the problem with restricting liquidity is that there are unpredictable and uninsurable legitimate spending needs before retirement, and so that could create some motivation for wanting to provide some flexibility in the retirement savings system. So we're going to set up a very simple model, and this is very simple because we want to prove some clean theoretical results. So we're going to actually have theorems in this presentation. And so households are only going to live for 2 periods in this model. So period 1 you can think of as working life. Period 2 you can think of as retirement. Consumption in period 1 is C1. It's going to produce utility, which is theta times some function of that consumption, U of C1. And for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to make that function log. So theta times log of C1 is going to be utility of consumption in the first period. Theta is a random variable that's drawn from some distribution, and so it's going to lie between 2 positive numbers, theta lower bar and theta upper bar. And then consumption in period 2 is C2, and that's going to produce utility that's a function V of that amount of consumption. And again, for the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to make that V function the log function. Now, there's a benevolent social planner, and the planner has some preferences over how the household should be consuming over their life cycle. So that's going to be the sum of the 2 utilities from consumption during the working life and during retirement, and there's going to be a delta that multiplies the utility of consumption in period 2 because future utility is worth less than present utility. So that's just going to be a time discount factor lying between 0 and 1. Now, the key thing is that this theta parameter, the kind of the how valuable consumption is before retirement, for an individual is not going to be observable by the social planner, even though the social planner knows the kind of the population-wide distribution of what this theta looks like. And so if you have a high theta, pre-retirement consumption is going to be really valuable. If you have low theta, well, pre-retirement consumption is not going to be particularly valuable. Now, for households, they have preferences too, but they differ from the social planner. And so there's going to be an extra beta term that multiplies retirement consumption. And that beta is going to lie between 0 and 1. And that's going to represent excessive impatience by the household. So they discount the feature too much. That beta lies between 0 and 1. If beta equals 1, that means that the household kind of has the right preferences, and they line up with the benevolent social planner. As beta falls towards 0, there's going to be too much impatience, and so that's going to be a motive to try to tie the household's hands. We're going to have to give a shape to this theta parameter, this taste shock, that determines exactly how valuable consumption is before retirement. And for the baseline example, we're just going to make this a normal distribution that's centered around 1, has a standard deviation of 0.25, and we're going to truncate it at 1/3 and 5/3. Now, the planner's problem is the planner has to set up a savings account system. So there are going to be n different savings accounts that the planner can choose. And for each of the savings accounts, the planner chooses how much to put into the account in period 1 and what the early withdrawal penalty is going to be as a % of the amount withdrawn. So we're going to start off with the scenario where there's autarky. By that I mean that penalties for early withdrawal cannot be distributed to other people. They just get burned up. So it's like kind of flushing that stuff down the toilet. There are real resources that are destroyed from the economy when an early withdrawal penalty is levied on a person. We're also going to start off with this case where everybody has the same level of self-control, and so everybody has the same beta value. And there is a remarkable theorem that can be proved under very general conditions, first proved by Angeletos, Werner, and Amador in an econometrica paper in 2006. This is the optimal system actually has only 2 accounts. So you can, even if you can have kind of an infinite number of different accounts, the social planner only wants to set up 2 accounts, one that is completely liquid, like a checking account, and one that is completely illiquid, which is like Social Security or a DB pension. But now let's make the world a little bit more complicated. Let's say that the planner can redistribute early withdrawal penalties. And so when I charge you for withdrawing early from your 401k or IRA, that money gets redistributed to people who don't withdraw early. And again, we're going to have everybody having the same degree of self-control. And turns out that we can prove that a system with one completely liquid account and one completely illiquid account is not optimal. And the reason for this is that in the previous case of autarky, levying early withdrawal penalties is really costly because those penalties just get burned up and lost to the entire economy. And so it's inefficient to have a system where anybody is paying an early withdrawal penalty. But now if you can redistribute those penalties, then the optimal penalty looks something like this. So on the horizontal axis is the beta value for the population. That's the amount of self-control that people have. And on the vertical axis is the optimal penalty for the partially illiquid account. So basically, what you want to set up as the social planner is one liquid account and one partially illiquid account that has an early withdrawal penalty that is equal to 1 minus beta. Okay, so the dotted red line is the 1 minus beta line, so that's the 45-degree line, and the blue line represents the optimal penalty from the partially illiquid account. You can see that those 2 lines are very close to each other. And so empirically, beta has been estimated to be about 0.7, so there's about 30% too much underweighting of the future. And so the optimal penalty then is going to be a 30% early withdrawal penalty from the partially illiquid account. And the intuition is very simple. I am underweighting the future by 30%, and so I can correct that bias as the social planner by slapping a 30% tax on early consumption. Now let's make the world even a little bit more complicated. Let's say that not only can we transfer these early withdrawal penalties across people, but people have different levels of self-control. So we have heterogeneous beta, and here's our next theorem. Let's take the really stark case where agents either have perfect self-control or absolutely no self-control at all. So beta equals 0 or 1. In this case, we can prove that the optimal system, again, has only 2 accounts. Now the accounts are going to be one completely liquid account and one completely illiquid account like Social Security or a DB pension. So even though we now have these transfers, we are back to the same optimal system that we had when there was autarky. And the intuition is that a completely liquid system is a disaster for people who have no self-control because they consume everything in the first period and they're left with nothing in the second period. So you don't want a completely liquid system. If you had a partially illiquid system that had these positive withdrawal penalties, then that increases inequality in period 2. And that's inefficient because utilities are diminishing with kind of wealth, and so that extra dollar is just worth less for the rich who happen not to have withdrawn in the first period, and you're kind of taking that away from the poor who have withdrawn in the first period. Now that's a pretty stark scenario where everyone has either perfect self-control or no self-control at all, and so what if we use a less extreme beta distribution? So here we have beta on the horizontal axis and the relative frequency of people with this beta value on the vertical axis, and we've chosen this particular distribution because its average is 0.7, which is around what the empirical estimate is for the overall population, and the modal agent in this population has no self-control problem. So that's a nod to the classical economic assumption that people are rational and unbiased. And so in this case, we can't prove theorems because we have just a more complicated setting, but we can do numerical simulations to figure out what the optimal system is. So let's say that the planner is constrained to only have 2 accounts in the system. It turns out that our theorem from before carries over to this more complicated case. You only want to, you want to set up a system where there's one completely liquid account, one completely illiquid account. And when you do that, there actually is a welfare gain of 3.4% of income relative to a system where there's only one completely liquid account. Now, suppose we allow the planner to have one more account. So the planner can set up a 3-account system. The planner is going to keep those first 2 accounts just the same, one checking account and one Social Security account. And the 3rd account is going to be a partially liquid account, and its optimal early withdrawal penalty is 9%, which is remarkably close to the 10% penalty that we have in the US. The other interesting thing about this result is that the welfare gain from that 3rd account is minuscule, only 0.018% of income. Basically, it doesn't really matter whether you have this account or not, and so this could be one explanation why in the US we have this partially illiquid account. Other countries don't have this partially illiquid account, and this theory is saying that you could really go either way and it doesn't really matter, and so that's why you might see this kind of diversity across the world. Now, what about leakage? Well, it turns out that the planner in theory puts 14% of partially and fully illiquid accounts or assets into the partially illiquid account. Now that's actually not far off from what you see in the data for married couples. So in 2008, as a percent of personal retirement accounts plus DB pension plus Social Security, the amount in IRAs and 401ks was about 12%. Okay, so we're kind of getting a quantitative match. Now, we'll note that for the median single household, that percentage was 0, so we're not really matching that particular moment. But the striking thing is that there is a lot of leakage before retirement in this optimal system. So 74% of dollars in the partially illiquid account leaks out in period 1. And that's for a couple reasons. One is that there are a lot of legitimate spending needs in period 1 that we want to accommodate. And second, when we levy those early withdrawal penalties on these early withdrawers, that money doesn't get flushed down the toilet. It benefits the rest of us who are not withdrawing early from our retirement accounts, and so it's pretty much a wash. We've tried all sorts of other parameterizations. We've tried varying risk aversion, the shape of the taste shock distribution, the distribution of self-control in the population. And across all these different simulations, we find the optimal early withdrawal penalty from the partially illiquid account is between 6% and 13%, so really centered around that 10% number. And we get very high leakage, 65% to 90%, which is substantially above the 40% leakage rate that we see in the US economy. So you can think of this paper as a little bit of a Dr. Strangelove paper, how I learned to stop worrying, love leakage. What it's saying is that the optimal system might actually feature a lot of leakage. And so kind of the takeaway from the paper is that the US retirement savings system might, and I really stress the might, be close to optimal in its overall structure. Within this highly simplified model, what we show is that you really want a completely illiquid layer like Social Security, and that completely illiquid layer achieves almost all of the welfare gains that are possible from policy. You can add a 401k or IRA system on top of that, but it adds only a tiny, tiny, tiny bit to welfare. Now, if you do have that system, you want a penalty, that early withdrawal penalty that's about 10%, And a high leakage rate from that system is going to be optimal, again, because some of that leakage is for legitimate purposes, and those early withdrawal penalties are redistributed to the rest of the population and are not lost to the economy. Now, I want to leave you with an important caveat, which is that the theory is assuming that the optimal amount of dollars is deposited to each account in the pre-retirement period. So if you thought that the current level of Social Security and DB benefits is inadequate, then our current system is not optimal. So we have kind of the right amounts of illiquidity and liquidity in the different accounts, and we have the penalties right, but maybe we want more dollars in the illiquid layer, and so what that means is that we would want to create a new illiquid layer or a new illiquid account to get that illiquid layer big enough in our current system. Thank you.